Arch Disability Law Center presents How Accessibility Regulations Are Made.
Hi everyone, my name is Rachel and I am here with Carrie. We are lawyers. We work at Arch Disability Law Center. Arch works on disability rights law. With us is Gordon Fletcher from People First of Canada, Jim Roots from the Canadian Association of the Deaf, and Melanie Marsden-Myers from Arch Disability Law Center. Also with us are Pat Danforth and Heather Walkis from the Council of Canadians with Disabilities. Christine Donato from Communication Disabilities Access Canada is also joining us. We want to welcome you to our video series. It is about the Accessible Canada Act. The Act is law in Canada. It became law in 2019. These 5 videos explain what the Accessible Canada Act is and how it works. They describe how accessibility rules are made under the Act. This information will help people with disabilities and deaf people get involved with the work that comes with this Act. There are many other regulations that are not called accessibility rules, but they still affect people with disabilities and deaf people. It is important for people with disabilities and deaf people to get involved in making these regulations too. The information in this video can help you understand how to do this. We made these videos with the help of our partners. Our partners are the Canadian Association of the Deaf, Communication Disabilities Access Canada, the Council of Canadians with Disabilities, the National Coalition of People Who Use Guide and Service Dogs in Canada, and People First of Canada. In this video series, we will call the Accessible Canada Act the Act for short.
There are 5 videos in this series. The first video talks about the Accessible Canada Act. The second video is about accessibility regulations and standards, or rules and guidelines. This is the third video in the series. It talks about how the Government of Canada, the Canadian Transportation Agency, and the CRTC make regulations. The fourth video gives tips about how you can give input when new regulations are made. And the fifth video is about where you can find regulations once they are made and how you might want to use them. These videos are all available on Arch's website at www.archdisabilitylaw.ca. There are short written summaries of each video. These have the main points of each topic. They will also tell you where to find more information about each topic. You can find these summaries on Arch's website. Arch has found that there are barriers in the process of making these rules. A barrier is anything that does not allow people with disabilities or deaf people to be included in giving input about what these rules should say. A barrier prevents people with disabilities or deaf people from taking part in activities. You can read Arch's recommendations on how to remove these barriers on our website.
Why would people with disabilities and deaf people want to help make these accessibility rules? Why is this input important?
People with disabilities and deaf people face barriers in their everyday lives. They want accessibility rules that will get rid of these barriers. Taking part is a way to tell the government, the Canadian Transportation Agency, and the CRTC about your experiences living with barriers. They need to know about your experiences living with barriers. They need to know about your experiences facing discrimination. This is important information. It can help rulemakers understand how to make regulations that will work better for you and other people with disabilities. Better rules can help make federal organizations more accessible. Jim Roots, from the Canadian Association of the Deaf, shares some thoughts about this.
Hi, I'm Jim Roots. Remember the federal government passed a law called the Accessible Canada Act? Now, the government is looking to implement it. How does it do this? The federal government sets up guidelines called accessibility regulations. Now, the government is calling for people, individuals, organizations, everyone to participate in the process of developing these regulations. This means you can participate. You can offer your ideas, your preferences, your hopes, and wishes for improving accessibility for deaf people and people with disabilities all across Canada. This is your opportunity. We encourage you to participate. It's really important for deaf people to participate. Why? Because if you don't participate, deaf needs and deaf preferences will be ignored. Then who will decide about deaf needs and deaf preferences? Other people who are not deaf people. So please, participate. It's really important that you participate. Thank you.
Christine Donato from Communication Disabilities Access Canada shares her thoughts.
It is important that people with speech and language disabilities, their families, and support persons are consulted and involved in the development of accessibility regulations. We know our accessibility needs best, and we know what we want services to do to be accessible. Without our involvement, regulations may not meet our needs. Our voices must be heard throughout the process.
Gordon Fletcher from People First Canada shares his thoughts.
On a daily basis, I don't interact with every area that the CRTC has regulations in. But if I had control of things, there would be one thing I would like to see. I would like to see the same standards that CRTC has applied to TV applied to streaming services. There is a lot of streaming services such as Netflix, Amazon Prime, YouTube, and others that we get on our computers or devices or through satellites that don't have the same level of accessibility that our TV services do. I think having the same level of accessibility on these services would greatly benefit many end users like me.
Pat Danforth and Heather Walkus from the Council of Canadians with Disabilities remind us that it is important for people with disabilities and deaf people to give input about how the regulations could be improved.
Each decade, there has been significant changes that we had our voice in, and that's really important. Anytime we're looking at the future, we have to also know what the past looked like.
We have to be clear about the holes, where it's missing the gap, and certainly put that on record, even if it doesn't get changed. Because it'll be the next generations that when they review the regulations can say, look, we have to deal with this, we have to deal with that.
Let's say someone wants to get involved. They want to help make these new regulations. What parts of the process can they take part in?
The Government of Canada and the Canadian Transportation Agency use the same process for making regulations. In this process, there are two chances to give input. I'll tell you about each one in turn. The first stage is called the pre-consultation stage. This is the planning stage. It happens before the regulation is written. It's your first chance to give your input. In this stage, the government or the agency thinks about what they want the regulation to do. What is the goal of the regulation? Here are some of the ways they might ask for input. They might ask for written documents, they might hold meetings, or they might hold teleconference calls.
How does someone find out about a pre-consultation?
Pre-consultations are posted on the government and the agency's websites. The links are also in the written summary that goes with this video. You can find this written summary on ARCH's website.
Let's say someone decides to take part in this process. What happens to their input?
The government or the agency will first think about what the person had to say. Then they will decide if they're going to use it. And then they'll also decide how they're going to use it. Here are some of the ways they might use someone's input. They might put someone's feedback online for other people to read. They may also make a summary of what the person said and put that into a document. This is a way of sharing what they learned from input that people gave. They might include some of the person's feedback in the first draft of the regulation. People can check to find out if their feedback was used. Access the regulation once it is published. It may include your input. They might use the person's feedback to help make something called a guidance document. A guidance document is a written guide. It helps organizations follow regulations. It gives them ideas to make sure their business obeys the regulation. Guidance documents are voluntary. Some organizations use them and some do not. There is no penalty for not using one.
So I understand about the first way people can give their input. What about the second?
The second chance to take part in the Government of Canada or the Canadian Transportation Agency's regulation-making process is called pre-publication. It is also called the public comment stage. This takes place after the government or the agency has made a draft of the new regulation. This means it is the first attempt at making the regulation. It's not the final version yet. They need more input from the public first. The government or the agency wants to know what people think about the new rules before they are final. Here are some questions they want people to think about. These questions can help you give your input. What is your opinion on the new rules? Do you like the language they use in the regulations? Did they miss any details? Or did they leave anything important out of the regulations? People will have at least 30 days to write a response at this stage of the process. Sometimes the government or the agency will give more time. When they publish the draft regulation, they will say how long people have to give input.
When does the public comment process begin? How do people know when the government or the Canadian Transportation Agency is looking for input?
The government and the agency publish draft regulations in Part 1 of the Canada Gazette. The Canada Gazette is the official newspaper of the Government of Canada. People can find a copy of the draft regulations there. People can also find the website address in the written summary of this video on ARCH's website.
What happens after the public comment stage?
The government or the agency will think about people's input. Then they will decide if they're going to use it and how they might use it. Here are some of the ways they might use your input. They might put your feedback online for people to read. They may also make a summary of your input and put that into a document. This is a way of sharing what they have learned from your input. They might include some of your feedback when they make changes to the draft regulation. Or they may use your feedback to help further study the regulation. You can access the final regulation to find out if they made changes and what those changes are. They might use your feedback to help make a guidance document, like we discussed earlier. After this stage of the process, there are a few more steps before the regulation is finalized and published.
Does the Canadian Transportation Agency ask for feedback on regulations in other ways?
Yes, it does. The agency has an Accessibility Advisory Committee. This committee advises the agency on new regulations. They do this through meetings, consultations, and discussions.
Who is on the Accessibility Advisory Committee?
The Accessibility Advisory Committee is a diverse group. It's made up of people with disabilities and deaf people, people in the transportation industry, people from the Canadian Air Transport Security Authority, and people from the Canada Border Services Agency. The Accessibility Advisory Committee already has many members, but the Canadian Transportation Agency will consider new applications for members. Applications are considered on a case-by-case basis.
The CRTC's process to make regulations is a little different than the one used by the Government of Canada and the Canadian Transportation Agency. Why is that?
The CRTC has a process that is more like what you would get at a court or tribunal. This means that you get to respond to what other people have said about the regulation. It also means that the CRTC might hold a hearing.
How can people get involved in the CRTC regulation making process?
There are two chances to give input about regulations made by the CRTC. The first stage is called the policy-making stage. It is the planning stage. It happens before the CRTC writes the regulation. This stage is like the government and the agency's pre-consultation. The CRTC will usually ask for written input. In rare situations, it may hold a hearing. The CRTC publishes the input online. There is time for people to read the information that other people gave. Then you have the chance to comment on what other people have said.
You have told us about the first chance for people to give their input. What about the second?
The second chance to take part is when the CRTC has written and published a draft regulation. Input is usually given in writing. You also get to comment on written input from other people who are taking part in the process.
How does someone find out that the CRTC is consulting on a regulation?
The CRTC publishes all its consultations on regulations on its website. This website is included in the written summary of this video on ARCH's website. The CRTC also asks for input on its regulatory policies on its website. Some regulatory policies may be important to people with disabilities and deaf people. For example, there is a regulatory policy about video relay service.
Say that somebody wants to take part in the regulation making process, but they find that it is not accessible to them. What can they do? Can people ask for disability accommodations?
Yes, for example, there could be many accommodations needed for a person to take part. A person with a communication disability might need a person to help them. They might need someone to help with communication or note-taking. A person with a disability or a deaf person might ask for alternate formats. They may request American Sign Language, langue des signes québécois, or plain language documents. A person may need documents that can be read with a screen reader. Or they may want documents with a bigger font or more white space and pictures. People with disabilities and deaf people may need more time to get ready for a consultation. It might take them more time to give written input. It might also take more time to reach other members of disability communities who may want to take part. If this happens, you need to let the government, the agency, or the CRTC know. Let them know in advance that you will need more time to get ready. Tell them how much time you need and ask if they can accommodate you. Here are 5 key points to learn from watching this video. First, the Accessible Canada Act says that 3 organizations can make accessibility regulations. These are the Government of Canada, the Canadian Transportation Agency, and the CRTC. You can find more information about the Act and its regulations in the first video in this series. Second, there are two ways to take part when the government or the Canadian Transportation Agency makes new regulations. The first is the pre-consultation stage. This is where the government or the agency asks for input on its ideas and goals for the regulation. The second is the public comment stage. This is where the government or the agency has written a draft of the regulation. They ask for input on the language and rules in the draft. The CRTC uses a process that's a little different. When they make regulations and regulatory policies, it is more like a court or tribunal. You can give input on the goals of the regulation at the policy-making stage, and you can comment on the draft regulation as well. Third, you can ask for disability accommodations if you need them to give input about regulations that are being made. You can ask for what you need to give input in an accessible way. For example, you can ask for more time to give your input. Fourth, you can find out when new regulations are being made by checking certain websites. You can also find out when it's time to give your input. You can share your experiences and knowledge through your input. And you can educate people about the barriers that affect you or your community every day. This may help to get regulations that make a real difference in the lives of people with disabilities and deaf people. And fifth, after a consultation is finished, your input will be read and considered. It may be used in many different ways. There may be a summary of the information. It may be published or put online. It could be used to make regulations or changes to the regulations. It could be used to study the regulation further, or it could go into voluntary guidance documents. These will help businesses and organizations understand how to follow the regulation. Do you want more information about how regulations are made? If so, you can go to the written summary of this video on ARCH's website.
ARCH thanks the Government of Canada's Social Development Partnerships Program Disability Component for funding this project. The information in this video materials is not intended to be legal advice. Consult a lawyer or legal worker if you need legal advice on a specific matter. The information in this video is current as of March 31st, 2021.